2025 has been the year that Ukraine focused intently on destroying as much of Russia's oil infrastructure as it could with long-range strikes. And there's a good reason why. The more of its infrastructure that collapses, the less oil that Russia has to supply its soldiers, people, and war chest. Oil is the very last thing that is keeping Russia alive. And in one night, Ukraine obliterated yet more of the oil infrastructure that Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin cronies rely on to prop up the failing Ukraine invasion. There are fires all over Russia because Ukraine's drones have struck oil once again. Over the course of the night between December 13th and 14th, Ukraine launched a volley of drone strikes against Russia that caused explosions and outbreaks of fire at some of the country's most important oil and energy facilities. Air raid sirens blared. Local authorities panicked. Yet again, Ukraine proved to the Russian people that their president has both invited a war into their country and that he is unable to stop Ukraine from picking apart targets that not only aid Russia's military, but are key to the lifestyle that everyday Russians lead. Ukraine hit facilities all over Russia during its brilliant nighttime raid. In Uryapinsk, which is in the Volgograd region, an oil depot went up in flames. Russian oil refineries were once again targeted, with production facilities in Krasnodar Krai and Yaroslavl being the latest targets of Ukraine's devastating drones. And in the Smolensk region, Ukraine showed Putin that two can play at the energy strike game, and its drones scored direct hits on a thermal power plant that supplies citizens in the region. If it serves Russia's war effort, it's become fair game for Ukraine. And Ukraine hunted a lot of game on December 13th and 14th. New Sky has published a report on Ukraine's strikes, starting with the attack on the oil depot in Uryapinsk. The outlet reveals that Russian sources claim that Ukraine's drones entered the region of Volgograd at around 0:45 Kyiv time, and soon started wreaking havoc. Explosions were heard throughout the city, followed by columns of flames that arose from a now devastated oil depot. UNN also reported on this strike, noting that they are part of the Ukrainian military's ongoing efforts to weaken the Russian war machine by taking out oil supplies. This weakening occurs in several ways. Most directly, Russian oil going up in flames is oil that can't be sent to the front lines in Ukraine. When Russia is deprived of the fuel that its military needs, it launches fewer mechanized assaults because its armor can't go anywhere. That's ideal for Ukraine's defenders, who can focus their drones and other weapons on Russian soldiers who are forced into meat assaults, in which they blindly move forward on foot, while desperately hoping that Ukraine doesn't catch them in the act. However, in the wider sense, taking out Russian oil also means that Russia loses a valuable product that it can no longer sell to its customers. That has a massive economic effect on both the country and the military. We'll explore the topic in greater detail later in the video. Returning to the Uryapinsk strike, it was severe enough that even the Russian authorities, which so often try to ignore Ukraine's long-range success, were forced to comment. New Sky says that Andriy Bocharov, who is the governor of the Volgograd Oblast, which includes Uryapinsk, was forced to publicly confirm Ukraine's strike. Though he trotted out an old chestnut that we've heard ad nauseum throughout the war. Ukraine's drones hadn't struck with a direct strike, Bocharov claimed. The fire at the oil depot was due to falling debris from a drone, the regional governor claimed. It never ceases to amaze how accurate Ukraine's drone debris seems to be. If we didn't know any better, we'd think that Ukraine has somehow managed to build GPS into the debris that Russia claims comes raining down on its oil facilities. Of course, we do know better. Debris has nothing to do with the fire at Uryapinsk. Instead, Ukraine's drones scored direct hits at a depot that is home to 18 tanks that regularly receive and store fuel transferred to Uryapinsk from oil refineries. This fuel appears to be used to serve the people of the city, meaning Russia will now have to redirect fuel from elsewhere to prevent shortages in Uryapinsk. Speaking of fuel, Ukraine didn't limit itself to oil depots on the night of December 13th and into 14th. Russia's refineries were once again on the Ukrainian menu, and two of them were struck with drones during Ukraine's overnight assault. Again, New Sky has the basic details, as it reports that Russian media is reporting on attacks on oil refineries in the Krasnodar Krai and Yaroslavl. The strike in the latter territory may be the most important of the two, as Ukraine's drones touched down in the Slavneft Yanos refinery, which the outlet says is one of the largest oil refineries in all of Russia. Explosions at both refineries were reported by local residents, though officials would only speak of localized fires and downed drones, as though those drones hadn't just taken out yet more infrastructure at some of Russia's most important oil refining facilities. As for the refinery in Krasnodar Krai, Ukraine struck the Afipsky facility, which has been a regular target for Ukraine ever since the summer. Energy News Beat says that this most recent strike represents the sixth that Ukraine has carried out since July, and that the Afipsky facility has recorded a drop in output of between 20 and 30% as a result. That's the entire point of Ukraine's refinery strikes. As the less fuel these refineries can make, the less gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel Russia has to send to its soldiers or sell to other countries. While Russia talked about the successful work of air defenses in the Krasnodar Krai region, residents reported strong explosions, broken windows, and powerful vibrations, all of which indicate powerful explosions that didn't take place in the sky. Ukraine's drones were hitting their targets, and the Afipsky refinery has proven itself as vulnerable to Ukraine's strikes in December as it was during the summer. But that's a statement that could be made about any Russian oil refinery. The Kremlin just can't seem to stop Ukraine from hitting these valuable pieces of infrastructure. On November 1st, the Kyiv Independent highlighted just how intense Ukraine's targeting of Russian oil has become. From January through to October, Ukraine had carried out 160 strikes against Russian oil refining and extraction, per the head of the country's security service, Vasyl Malyuk. At least 20 of these strikes were conducted during September and October, as Ukraine's drones hit targets that included a pair of oil terminals, 3 fuel depots, and 9 pumping stations. 6 of Russia's oil refineries were also hit. These are legitimate military targets. Oil extraction and refining make up around 90% of Russia's defense budget. These are the dirty petro-rubles funding the war against us, Malyuk said, in comments that again touch on the devastating economic consequences of Ukraine's decision to target Russia's oil sector. Ukraine didn't slow down its strike rate in November. Quite the opposite, in fact, as Russia's refineries became an even bigger target for Ukraine's drones during that month. Whatever paper-thin air defenses these refineries have, assuming they have defenses at all, failed completely, as Ukraine managed to pull off at least 14 strikes against Russian refineries. The Moscow Times reports that this strike rate, which amounts to almost 1 refinery attack every 2 days, was a new monthly record for Ukraine, as it again stepped up its efforts to destroy Russia's oil lifeline. The Afipsky plant that Ukraine hit during its December 13th and 14th strikes was also hit in November. The Moscow Times also reveals that this facility has an annual capacity of 9.1 million tons, cementing its position as one of Russia's largest refineries. This constant campaign of refinery strikes is bearing fruit, as the outlet reports. Russia's average daily refining volume has fallen to around 5 million barrels per day as a result of the intensified campaign, down from the 5.3 to 5.5 million barrels per day typically processed in late autumn, the Moscow Times says. There are a few weeks left to go before we learn whether Ukraine has had a record-breaking refinery run in December. But with 2 successful strikes in one night, it seems that Ukraine has no intention of slowing down anytime soon. More Russian energy targets were on Ukraine's docket in December, as Smolensk also had to deal with Ukraine's drones. We say deal, more accurately a thermal plant in Smolensk was hit hard on December 11th, demonstrating that Ukraine is playing a game of tit-for-tat with Russia on the energy infrastructure front. News Sky has some of the details, noting that the Russian Defense Ministry once again claimed that the drones Ukraine sent were shot down. However, those drones also managed to cause fires. Debris must be doing damage again. Russia has decried attacks like the one carried out at Smolensk as terroristic, in what can only be described as a hypocritical lambasting of Ukraine at a time when Russia is conducting strikes just like these on Ukraine's territory. News Sky highlights this, stating that Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, which can deprive Russian citizens of access to electricity and heating, are only being carried out because Russia is conducting these very types of attacks against Ukraine. The Kremlin has long used winter, electricity, and heat as weapons, and now Russian regions are increasingly experiencing such vulnerability, News Sky says, adding that Ukraine rarely publicly confirms or denies its involvement in strikes against Russia's energy sector. December 13th and 14th are no different. Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility for the Smolensk strike, though it's clear who was behind it. Having said that, UNN reports that the Smolensk thermal power plant has far more military-serving applications than civilian-serving ones. Despite Russia's condemnation of what it's dubbed a terrorist attack, Smolensk's plant is a legitimate military target because it enables the operation of chemical production plants that serve Russia's defense industry, the outlet says. Without this plant, Russian facilities won't be able to produce as much nitrates, ammonia, and nitrogen fertilizers, all of which are building blocks for the explosives used in many of Russia's missiles and bombs. Even if that wasn't the case, Ukraine would still feel justified in targeting a thermal power plant that serves Russia's people. As we've pointed out, much of Russia's winter strategy in 2025 and previous years hinges on depriving as many of Ukraine's citizens of power as possible. It's also a strategy that works. December 13th saw the BBC report that around 1 million Ukrainian homes had been left without electricity after a barrage of overnight strikes that followed on from the several months of similar strikes that have caused blackouts and heating outages. By targeting thermal power plants, Russia is actively trying to freeze out Ukrainian citizens. This violates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, which states that every person has rights to an adequate standard of living, the University of Alabama at Birmingham points out. Russia is trying to deprive Ukraine's citizens of this right. Ukraine is now doing the same to Russia's people. As a result, strikes like those in Smolensk occupy a moral grey area. Many will claim that Ukraine is just feeding Russia a hefty dose of the terrible medicine that Putin has forced down the Ukrainian throat every winter since he launched his invasion. Ukraine could also support its attack on the Smolensk thermal power plant by pointing out how that plant serves Russia's military-industrial complex. Even so, Ukraine is technically breaking the same rules as Russia with attacks like these, which is why it rarely, if ever, claims responsibility. Though this series of strikes against Russian oil and energy naturally grabs the headlines because they're part of Ukraine's overall strategy to sever Russia's oil lifeline, they were far from the only strikes that Ukraine pulled off in a bruising few days for Russia. Ukraine's own general staff highlighted this in a December 14th Facebook post where it pointed out that Ukraine had also taken the opportunity to strike several facilities in the Russian-occupied portions of Ukraine. In Zaporizhia, Ukraine destroyed a building used by Russia's unmanned service members, in addition to taking out a missile complex required for a Tor M2 air defense system to do its job. In the occupied Donetsk region, a pair of control points used by Russia's 76th Air Assault Division were destroyed, along with a radio location station and a pair of electronic warfare stations. Crimea, which has so often been the target of Ukraine's drones and missiles, also didn't escape. In addition, at the TOT of Ukrainian Crimea, our soldiers struck 2 PMM bases, the radio station Kasta 2E2 and the valuable element for PPO systems C300-C400, the radio station 96L6E, the Ukrainian General Staff reports. And that still doesn't cover everything. The Kyiv Independent adds that Russia claimed to have shot down 41 Ukrainian drones over Crimea on the same night as the oil depot and refinery strikes. That may be the case, but drones still appear to have struck another oil depot, this one located in the Simferopol region of Crimea. Veliki Novgorod was also targeted as Ukraine hit the Akron chemical plant in that region with drones that caused smoke to rise from the facility, the same outlet reports. Russia must have wondered what hit it. Far from being weakened to the point of surrender by Russia's winter campaign, Ukraine is coming out swinging with drone strikes on an immense scale that further weaken Russia's military might. Not that you would know if you listened to Russia. We've already revealed that Russia trotted out the old drone debris excuse for several of Ukraine's successful strikes, as well as telling you that Russia is pretending that all is well in Crimea and that all of Ukraine's drones were down. News Sky adds that December 14th saw Russia create its own version of events, in which it destroyed 141 of Ukraine's drones in the skies of Volgograd, Smolensk, Yaroslavl, and Krasnodar Krai. However, this reporting is contradicted by the fires and explosions caused by Ukraine's drones, as well as an alternate framing of the night's events being offered up by some corners of the Russian media. Russian pro-government media are trying to present the events as an episode of a massive terrorist attack by Kyiv, without addressing the question of why, after 2 years of full-scale war, strategic refineries and oil depots remain vulnerable to drones hundreds of kilometers from the Ukrainian border, News Sky reports. Russia is trying to have it both ways. Ukraine definitely didn't hit Russia, except when it did, and those strikes were done by a terroristic regime, not an intelligent military force that knows exactly how to hit Russia where it hurts. The Kremlin narrative continues to crumble, and it will eventually fall apart as Ukraine carries out more of these long-range assaults. Strikes like these are among the most impactful that Ukraine can carry out for several reasons. The first of those reasons is something that we highlighted earlier in the video. Each time Ukraine hits Russian oil or energy, the economic and military impacts reverberate throughout Russia. The Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute highlighted this fact in a November 11th piece where it revealed that Ukraine has targeted roughly 55% of Russia's oil refineries since the beginning of the war. Those attacks have grown more intense and successful in 2025. The year has seen Ukraine carry out 48% more successful refinery strikes than it did in 2024, resulting in about 20% of Russia's total refining capacity being dismantled. The impact on Russia's budget is obvious when you realize that about 30% of that budget came from the taxes that Russia charges on oil and gas sales in 2024. The maths is really simple here. More Ukrainian refinery strikes plus less oil being refined equals a massive hole being burned in the collective Russian bank balance. Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty staffers also wrote a piece for oilprice.com on November 29th that offered more interesting figures. That piece claims that Russia's refining capacity was cut by 10% rather than by 20%, though it's still an astonishing number. The article adds that fossil fuels bring about $100 million per year to Russia, though even that number is 20% lower than it was in 2024. Inside Russia, gasoline rationing and shortages have become rife. Plus, there is the obvious issue that arises when fuel goes up in flames. Money and fuel are needed to keep the war going, and Russia is slowly being bled of both by Ukraine. Ukraine also gains as Russia loses thanks to these types of strikes. How? Well, Ukraine gains leverage, at least according to a December 4th Forbes article written by Vikram Mittal. The Forbes contributor makes note of Ukraine's strikes against Russian oil, in addition to the many instances of Ukraine destroying Russian military equipment, factories, and other war-related infrastructure with its drones and missiles. On the near term, these long-range drone strikes will have significant implications for the ongoing peace talks, Mittal writes. By demonstrating the ability to hit strategic targets deep inside Russia, Ukraine shows that it can continue inflicting meaningful damage if the war continues. In other words, Ukraine's drones punch holes in the narrative of an inevitable Russian victory that the Kremlin wants to spread. The fact that they're happening at all, never mind at the sheer scale that we see now, tells anybody who's paying attention that Ukraine is a long way from being out of the fight. Add the economic damage that we've already discussed, and Ukraine can make the case that all it needs to do is keep hitting Russia with its drones, and the country will eventually bleed out financially. Putin will be forced to end his invasion in that scenario. That possibility alone offers Ukraine far more leverage at the negotiating table than many give it credit for having. What Ukraine is proving, time and time again, is that Russia's deep rear is not only no longer safe, but it practically no longer exists. Ukraine can hit targets hundreds of miles inside Russia, and it's doing so with enough regularity to demonstrate that Russia's military is stretched too thin. Oil refineries and similar facilities should have unbeatable air defenses, especially now that it's clear how intent Ukraine is on targeting them. Yet Putin doesn't send air defenses to these facilities. That's because Russia's air defenses are needed inside Ukraine, which leaves most of the deep rear that Putin assumed would be safe exposed. Russia could move more air defenses to these facilities, though that would equate to the direct weakening of the defenses protecting its soldiers inside Ukraine. Or Russia keeps doing what it's doing, accept that Ukraine is going to hit its refineries, depots, and practically any other targets of its choosing in Russia and occupied Ukraine. Either choice is a win for Ukraine. And that's a problem for which Putin has no solution. If all of these strikes against oil and thermal energy weren't enough, Ukraine has also expanded its assaults to include Russia's liquid natural gas. We saw that earlier in December when Ukraine struck at a key gas port that Russia uses to export one of its fossil fuels to other countries. Find out more about that strike and what it means for Russia's economic lifeline in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's many drone strikes inside Russia. And thank you for watching.